Hi and welcome to Pixelpile, where we are all about designing games. In this video we will continue working on the Vixen game that we started in part 1. We got a lot of basic mechanics working and the core gameplay loop is running. But despite having a basic skeleton of a game in place, there isn't much meat on those bones. So where do we go from here? This time we'll be looking into some ways where we can make some areas of the game, especially the core gameplay loop, a little more interesting. Right now we only have one type of enemy, a simple red box that spews a few balls in the direction of the player as it flies in a singular path straight forward. Not that there's anything wrong with that, most games have that basic enemy that can fill the screen and give the player some easy victories, especially to get the game started. And while one way of increasing difficulty in a game is simply to add more enemies, it's just more of the same. You could also make enemies that are just bigger, stronger versions of the original enemies, but most of the time it does not change the experience, although there are exceptions. Instead we are going for a concept often called chess pieces. The goal is to create enemy types that are individually different from one another, but can also play well together to create different challenges and experiences for the player. In this regard, our basic red box is just a pawn, a simple piece we can add to fill out the board, but even adding a single knight or rook to an encounter makes it a very different challenge that the player needs to tackle differently than before. So let's start making some new enemy types, and we'll see how far we get before we run out of geometrical shapes to distinguish them from one another. First, let us start with creating some red circle enemies. These will be a berserker type enemy, and their goal is to ram into the player and deal damage that way. So instead of having to avoid their fire, the player has to avoid the enemy itself. And to keep it fair, they are not going to have any ranged weapons. They are also not going to be perfectly homing, or they would be way too hard to avoid. This of course means that if the only enemy you are facing is a berserker, then it's not hard to avoid it. But since we are talking about chess pieces here, its role is to force the player to move in order to avoid damage. The next new enemy is going to be a red triangle. This will be a laser turret that charges up its, laser and shoots a beam that will do damage over time as long as the player is in the beam. To keep it fair, we will give the player some warning often where it's going to shoot, and it will not rotate while firing. The role of this chess piece is to restrict movement. When it's charging its laser, it will of course force movement by telling the player to get out of the beam. While it's firing, there is a part of the screen where the player doesn't want to move to, or else they will be damaged. The last new enemy we are going to introduce is a red box. I mean a big red box. Okay, so I guess this was as far as we got before running out of geometrical shapes. But still, I don't think the red box enemies will be mistaken for each other, so everything is fine. But in any case, this will be the Hulk, a weapons platform that fires a burst of projectiles in an arc in front of itself. Unlike the pawn, this one does not auto-aim, it only shoots forward. The point is not to be an enemy that just shoots more, its role is intended to restrict movement by denying an area to the player. You just don't want to be in front of this enemy when it's firing. However, how does one defeat it then, considering the player can only fire forwards, at least for now? Well, that's why it fires in bursts, so that between these bursts there will be a gap where the player gets a chance to fire back at it. Since it's also a bigger enemy, it will also have a bigger health pool. Of course, that means it takes more time to destroy it. Unless of course we give the player some new tools to deal with it. Now currently as the player of our game, we do not have many ways of dealing with the enemies we face. We can move and avoid fire, and we can shoot straight forward. These are the moves we have available, and collectively this is the player moveset. Now back in the day, controllers, or joysticks as these were called, only allowed you to indicate a direction and press the button. Even if they had multiple buttons, they all did the same thing in game. They essentially counted as the same button. But console controllers and even cheap controllers these days have many more options for inputs. It's pretty much standard now to have a directional pad or D-pad, 2 thumbsticks, 4 buttons, plus 4 shoulder and trigger buttons. Even the thumbsticks are buttons. So no doubt there are plenty of input options for modern games to do more than just moving and shooting. You can even go beyond the number of available buttons by making input combinations, something that was earlier a necessity but is still often done today. So the question then becomes, how many moves shall we give the player? The higher the number, the more combinations of interesting mechanics can put into the game, which will add more depth to the game. However, it also adds more complexity if we don't do something to mitigate this. A common way to mitigate the complexity of high number of moves is to split them into several movesets, of which only one is active at a time. This is usually tied to different playable characters or equipped weapons by the player. Now I have a mantra when I design games, and that is that you should try to get as much depth as possible with as little complexity as possible. And especially action games like vertical shoot 'em ups, I prefer to keep very simple. So for Vixen there will be no input combinations. I could give additional movesets with different player ships or weapons, and I'll definitely explore this later. But for now, we will make a standard moveset with all the tools needed for the challenges of the game. We have already implemented a simple forward firing weapon. This is fine for dealing with basic box enemies, but the circle enemies are mobile enough that they often aren't in front of the player. So for starters, we're going to borrow a little from twin stick shooters and enable you to fire in any direction with this weapon. Next up, we need something that can handle the big box enemies. While our current weapon can eventually chew through its health, it's not optimal for the job. So we'll add a secondary weapon that deals a burst of damage all at once. In order to make sure this weapon is not just straight up better than the primary weapon, we're going to give it a much longer cooldown between shots, and it only fires forward. This makes it a superior weapon against the big tough enemies like the big boxes, but inferior against smaller mobile enemies like the circles. Our last weapon will be an area of effect weapon to deal with hordes of smaller enemies. So if the player is getting swarmed, they can use this to deal damage to anything near the player. We'll keep the damage minimal so the tougher enemies won't be affected much. This weapon is also intended to be a consumable that has limited uses. That will give another piece that works well with the whole forcing movement part of the enemies, in this case rewarding it. However, for now we will simply give it a really long cooldown and implement it proper in a future episode. The last move we're going to have is defense. Star Fox famously has the ability to make a barrel roll in order to dodge enemy fire. We're going to use a similar ability from Stardust, activating a shield. The result is the same, the player is temporarily invulnerable, so this is a good example of achieving the same mechanic but with different aesthetics. Now this moveset was chosen because it perfectly fits a modern controller. The amount of abilities is less than the number of buttons, and we can even double the inputs for the shoulder and trigger buttons, if those are preferred by the player. We even have room for a button for interacting with story elements or tutorials and the like. It's a really good idea to have such a button separate from the buttons for combat. That way you don't accidentally press it in the heat of battle and miss some important information because you happen to make an attack once the information was presented. Another important aspect is that we can make this work with mouse and keyboard as well. Keyboards have of course plenty of buttons, and for aiming the primary weapon we can simply use the mouse cursor. It's always a good idea to support as many control schemes as possible to give players more choice. Now, two control schemes that are not going to be supported by this game are going to be touchscreen and VR. If there was a way to make a game like this work on these sorts of inputs, we should definitely do so. But usually games need to be tailored for these to work efficiently. But one last thing before we continue is that in order to use our new moveset to its full effect, we need a way to know if our weapons and defenses are ready. For that, we'll add some indicators to the screen like this, and these will either show the moves as ready or their remaining cooldown. Now we should be able to test our chess pieces in different combinations and see how our moveset is able to deal with the challenges that they create. I could go into detail about every combination here, but I think I'll just let the footage speak for itself. So that will be the second episode documenting the building of the Vixen game. Still plenty of meat we can add to the bones of the game, so look forward to that in the next episodes. If however you're interested to see where this is going, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. With that said, I'll return in the next video.